The morning began with the kind of quiet only the mountains know. A hush so deep it almost hums, broken only by the slow groan of melting snow trickling through the pine roots. Evelyn Carter adjusted the camera strap across her shoulder and trudged farther into the forest boots, pressing soft dents into the wet earth. She was chasing light, how it filtered through the mist like silver smoke, but even in that stillness she could feel the pulse of the wild beneath her. It had rained all night, and the air still smelled of pine resin and the lingering scent of old storms. Somewhere in the distance a raven called once sharp and clean. She stopped, listened. Another sound came, faint, uncertain, a broken whimper, half breath, half cry. Not the echo of wind or creak of branches. It came again, shorter this time, like something small, trying not to be heard. Evelyn froze, every sense awake. Out here, cries like that could mean many things. Sometimes a fawn is separated from its mother. Sometimes a snare. She remembered what Mason had once told her during a photography assignment near Yellowstone years ago. If you ever hear pain that doesn't sound human, it's probably because it was caused by one. She moved toward the sound, taking each step carefully. Through the timber, the cry came clearer, ragged, soft, then silent. She reached a low ridge and saw movement in the underbrush. A flash of brown, then stillness. When she crouched and parted the wet ferns, her breath caught. It was a bear cub. Small, barely 3 months old, matted fur clumped with mud. Its paw was trapped in a rusted steel snare half sunk in the earth. The metal had bitten through the skin, blood mixing with rainwater. The cub's chest rose fast, panicked, but its body didn't move. It had given up struggling. Evelyn's camera strap slid off her shoulder into the dirt. She spoke before she thought. "Hey, easy, little one. Her voice came out softer than she expected, almost like she was talking to a child in a nightmare. The cub didn't flinch, only blinked slow and heavy. She edged closer, hands shaking. The trap was old, the kind illegal now, but still used by poachers who didn't care what they caught. She could smell the iron and old blood. The cub let out a hoarse cry, more breath than sound. Its eyes were dark amber, wide with the kind of fear that doesn't fade easily. Evelyn's chest tightened. For a moment she saw something else, her husband Daniel kneeling beside a similar trap years ago. He'd been a park ranger, then tall, calm, the kind of man who believed in laws meant to protect the wild. That day he'd freed a coyote snared near a campsite. A month later, he was gone. A poacher's bullet. She had told herself she left the city for peace, for the quiet of nature. But the truth was she'd come here to be where his voice still lingered in the trees. Now that same sound, the whimper of an animal in pain, pulled her straight into the past. Her throat ached, but her hands moved on instinct. She found a fallen branch, wedged it under the snare's locking bar, and pushed. The metal resisted, screeching softly. The cub whimpered again, eyes darting to her face. I know. Hold on." The mechanism gave suddenly, and she fell back, mud splattering her jeans. The cub's paw slipped free. It tried to stand, but collapsed, trembling. Evelyn crawled forward and wrapped her jacket around him, careful of his claws. He was lighter than she expected, all bones and damp fur. His heartbeat thudded fast against her arm. She could feel the life in him, weak, fragile, but stubborn. "You're all right now," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. For a moment, she sat there holding him, rain dripping from her hair onto his fur. The forest stayed quiet, watching. Then, as if on cue, a gust of wind moved through the pines, scattering needles like whispers. Evelyn looked around. The silence was heavy wrong. A mother grizzly would never leave a cub this long. Either she'd been killed or driven away. The thought settled cold in Evelyn's stomach. She couldn't leave him, but she also knew what bringing him back meant: paperwork, fines, questions from Fish and Wildlife. Interference with a protected species wasn't something you walked into lightly. Still, the alternative was worse. The cub's paw was swollen, blood still seeping from the wound. Without care, infection would take him before nightfall. She pulled the flannel tighter, tucking his head beneath her chin. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. Evelyn rose slowly and began the long walk back toward the road. The forest path was slick, and every step echoed with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Halfway down, the cub stirred, giving a soft, broken growl. The sound made her smile despite herself. "You've got spirit," she said quietly. "Good. You're going to need it." When she reached the old logging road, her truck was parked under a stand of birches. The storm had left the windows streaked with pine needles. She opened the door and laid the cub on the passenger seat, then hesitated. He looked impossibly small against the cracked leather, his fur still trembling from the cold. She tore off a strip from her undershirt and tied it gently around his paw to slow the bleeding. Then she started the engine. The heater sputtered to life, blowing lukewarm air. Evelyn glanced at her phone, no signal as usual. The nearest wildlife clinic was in Mercy Creek, 2 hours west if the mountain roads hadn't flooded. She pressed the gas and whispered, "Hang in there, little bear." The drive wound through narrow canyons where mist hugged the cliffs. Every few minutes, she looked over, half afraid he'd stopped breathing. Once his paw twitched. Once he whimpered softly. When she reached the wooden bridge crossing the creek, she slowed. Water rushed beneath brown and fast. For a second, she almost stopped the truck. What if Mason refused to take him? What if she was making things worse? But then the cub shifted again. A faint sound, almost a sigh. That tiny breath was enough to steady her. Sometimes that's all compassion needs, a single sound reminding you that life still wants a chance. People often say that wild animals don't belong in human hands. And they're right most of the time. But out here between the rules and the rain, the lines blur. Evelyn had seen what happened when people did nothing. The empty forests, the silence that replaced song. She knew that compassion wasn't about control. It was about response. Nature doesn't always need a savior, but sometimes it needs a witness willing to act. Halfway to Mercy Creek, she passed a rusted mailbox with a hand-painted bear on it. For a strange moment, it felt like a sign, like the mountains themselves were nudging her forward. The cub's paw rested against the edge of her jacket, tiny claws flexing unconsciously. He didn't know her name, didn't know the rules of this world, but he had trusted her enough to stop struggling. That trust weighed heavier than any camera she had ever carried. By the time she saw the first lights of Mercy Creek, night had begun to fall. The horizon burned faintly orange behind the ridges, and the air smelled of wet sage. The cub stirred again, eyes half open, glassy but alive. Evelyn reached over and brushed the edge of his fur. "Almost there," she said. "You're doing good." She thought of Daniel again, how he used to say every creature has its own way of saying thank you. Some roar, some run, some simply keep breathing. Maybe this cub's gratitude was just that, refusing to give up. When she pulled into the gravel lot of Mason Hale's clinic, the old wooden sign creaked in the wind, Mercy Creek Wildlife Rehabilitation and Veterinary Services. A yellow porch light flickered like a pulse. She parked, turned off the engine, and listened. The forest was quiet again, except for the steady rush of water beyond the tree line. The cub's breathing had slowed deeper now. Evelyn wrapped him in her jacket once more and stepped out into the cold air. Her boots crunched against the gravel. For a moment, she just stood there, the forest pressing close behind her, the clinic door ahead. One choice behind her, another waiting. Inside, she knew would come the hard questions. How, where, why she intervened. The law would call it interference. Her heart called it instinct. As she walked toward the porch, she thought about the strange symmetry of it all. Years ago, she had lost someone to a poacher's trap. Now she was carrying out of the woods the kind of life Daniel had once died protecting. The porch light hummed. Evelyn knocked once firm. The door opened, spilling warm light onto the mud. Dr. Mason Hale stood there, gray-bearded eyes, tired but kind. "What did you bring me this time, Ev?" She hesitated. "A grizzly cub. Snare wound. He's barely breathing." Mason's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. He stepped aside. "Bring him in." As she crossed the threshold, the air changed, the scent of antiseptic and hay, the low hum of machines. The cub stirred, one last flicker of instinct before sleep. Evelyn whispered his new name without thinking, like it had already been waiting for her. "You're safe now, Finn." Sometimes compassion doesn't roar, it just whispers through the pines and waits for someone to listen. And as the clinic door closed behind them, the storm outside began to fade. In the distance, the timber creaked, echoing the same question the forest had been asking all morning. What will you do with the life you've just held in your hands? By dawn, that question would have an answer, one written not in words, but in heartbeats. And at Mercy Creek, Dr. Mason Hale was already preparing for the long night ahead. The road twisted like a question that never quite found its answer. Rain had turned to mist clinging low to the hills as Evelyn drove, her headlights slicing through the gray. The grizzly cub. Finn lay curled in her jacket on the passenger seat, small chest fluttering with each uncertain breath. Every mile felt like a test of faith. The tires hissed over slick asphalt, the wipers clicking in uneven rhythm. Evelyn kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the cub, as if her presence alone might keep him anchored to life. She'd driven this route before, back when Daniel was alive. Mercy Creek wasn't much of a town, more a cluster of weathered houses, a feed store, and one clinic that handled both domestic pets and wild rescues. Dr. Mason Hale ran it with a quiet, stubborn grace that reminded Evelyn of the pines, solid, uncomplaining, always reaching upward, even in storms. She glanced at Finn again. His fur had started to dry in the heater's warmth, but the paw still bled slowly through the strip of torn fabric. The metal of that illegal trap had bitten deep down to the bone. She pressed her lips together. There was anger there, not just at the trap, but at the kind of indifference that left such things behind. Half an hour later, Mason answered the phone on the second ring. His voice was rough, the kind that carried fatigue and kindness in equal measure. Evelyn. What happened? She explained quickly, an abandoned grizzly cub snare wound, heavy bleeding. Silence followed. Then Mason said, "You know, cases like that rarely end well." "I know," she replied, "but he's still breathing. That might not be mercy," he said gently. She didn't respond. She knew what he meant. Sometimes helping an animal means stopping its suffering, not prolonging it. But Evelyn had already decided if Finn was still fighting, so would she. Mason sighed. "All right, bring him in. I'll prep the table. And Evelyn, drive carefully. The mountain roads are slick tonight." As she ended the call, a faint sound came from the passenger seat. A small grunt, half dream, half pain. Evelyn smiled despite herself. "You hear that, Finn? He's waiting for you." The road narrowed, curving along the Mercy River. She could see her reflection in the window. Tired eyes, streaked hair, the faint outline of someone who hadn't planned to care this much again. She hadn't meant to name the cub. That just happened. Maybe because silence needs something to hold on to, and names do, that they make things real. When she reached the edge of Mercy Creek, the town looked smaller than she remembered. The feed store's sign still swung in the wind. A neon light buzzed outside the diner, where Daniel once liked to stop for coffee after his patrols. She drove past without slowing. The clinic's porch light glowed warm against the dark. Mason was waiting at the door, sleeves rolled, eyes alert. The moment he saw the bundle in her arms, his voice softened. "Let me see him." Evelyn laid the cub gently on the metal table. Mason's practiced hands moved fast, checking pulse, eyes, breathing. "Severe laceration, dehydration possible." "Shock," he muttered. "You're lucky he made it here." "Not luck," she said quietly. "Stubbornness." Mason looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. "Let's start with fluids." Warm saline, slow drip. While he worked, Evelyn hovered, watching every movement. Finn whimpered softly as Mason cleaned the wound. "You know," Mason said after a while, "there's a reason we don't encourage people to bring in wild cubs, especially grizzlies." Evelyn folded her arms. "Would you have preferred I leave him?" He didn't look up. "No. But people forget that the wild has its own logic. Sometimes what looks cruel is balance." His words hit harder than she expected. She thought of Daniel again, of the way he used to explain predator cycles to tourists who complained about wolves. "Nature doesn't do mercy," he'd say. "It does continue." Evelyn looked at the small form on the table. Balance or not, no creature deserves to die like that. Mason paused, finally meeting her eyes. You're not wrong, but you have to understand if he survives, he may never go back to the wild. A bear that's been this close to humans rarely can. He'll associate safety with us. She hesitated. Then what happens to him? If he can't be released, there are sanctuaries, Mason said. Some good, some not, but at least he'll live. Evelyn nodded slowly. She understood the weight behind his words. To save him might mean caging him, but leaving him had never been an option. As Mason wrapped the paw, he explained more how young grizzlies learn survival from their mothers, how orphaned cubs often starve within days. Out here, he said, there are maybe 1,500 grizzlies left across Montana. We've lost more to traps and roads than anyone admits. He spoke without bitterness, just weary honesty. People think bears are the threat. Truth is, we're worse neighbors. Evelyn found herself whispering. Daniel used to say something like that. Mason's hands paused for a second, then resumed. Yeah, I remember him. Good man. Silence filled the room, thick as the smell of iodine. Then Mason straightened gloves, stained with antiseptic. All right, he said. He's stable for now, but the next 12 hours will tell us everything. Evelyn exhaled. What do you need me to do? Stay, Mason said simply. If he wakes, your voice will calm him. Just don't expect miracles. She nodded. I've learned not to. Mason cleaned up, then leaned against the counter, studying her. You know, most people would have kept driving. Maybe they've never watched something die in front of them, she said. Or maybe they've forgotten how much it matters not to. He smiled faintly, a tired curve of lips. That's the thing about you, Evelyn. You keep showing up even when the forest doesn't ask for it. The line settled between them like a quiet understanding. She didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say. After a while, Mason turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft glow from the lamp above the table. He'll sleep now, he said. You should too. Evelyn pulled a stool beside the cub and sat. The clinic hummed softly, refrigerators, distant rain, the faint ticking of a clock. Finn's breathing steadied slow and rhythmic. Outside, thunder rolled far across the valley. Mason's truck headlights swept the window as he left for a moment to prepare more supplies. In the half-light, Evelyn thought about how quickly everything had changed. She'd gone out that morning to capture stillness and found life instead. She watched the cub twitch in sleep, one paw flexing as if running in some remembered forest. You'll walk again, she murmured. You'll climb and fish and do all the things your kind was meant to do. The words weren't for him. They were for herself, a promise against the quiet ache of failure she'd carried too long. Hours passed. Mason returned, checked vitals, and adjusted the IV. Temperature's holding, he said. That's a good sign. Evelyn rubbed her eyes. How many have you saved like this? Mason shrugged. Enough to know not all stories end the way we want, but sometimes they end better than we expect. He leaned back, arms crossed. You ever think about how thin the line is between wild and tamed? Every day, she said. He nodded. That's where we work, in that line, trying to make it matter. It wasn't a lecture, just truth spoken from years of watching both succeed and fail. Evelyn respected that. Something was grounded in his honesty, like the forest itself, harsh but fair. By midnight, Finn stirred again. His head lifted weakly. He blinked once, eyes cloudy but aware. Evelyn leaned closer, whispering, Hey there, you made it this far. That's something. Mason checked his heartbeat, still strong. The room fell quiet again. Evelyn thought about how fragile. Everything looked under fluorescent light, the cub, the tools, even her own hands. Yet beneath it all, something persistent kept moving forward. Instinct, hope. And that was the lesson buried inside all this. Sometimes compassion isn't about knowing what's right. It's about refusing to do nothing. As the clock neared 3, Mason yawned and said softly, He's holding steady. If he makes it till morning, we'll start the next steps." Evelyn nodded, barely awake. Her voice came out like a promise. "He will." Mason looked at her for a moment, then smiled. "You sound sure?" "I have to be." He turned off the last light, leaving only the glow from the incubator where Finn slept. The rain outside eased into a soft drizzle, like the earth itself was catching its breath. Evelyn leaned back, her head against the wall, eyes half closed. The cub's breathing filled the silence, each rise and fall a small defiance against the odds. Through the window, dawn began to creep across the valley, a thin line of pale gold slicing the horizon. Mason stepped back into the room, coffee in hand. "Sun's coming up," he said quietly. Evelyn stood, stretching, eyes still fixed on the cub. "Then we made it through the night." Mason smiled faintly. "The first miracle of many, if we're lucky." As the light spread through the clinic, Evelyn felt something unfamiliar but welcome settle in her chest, not certainty, but direction. The kind you don't choose but answer. Outside, the forest began to stir again. Ravens calling, river murmuring under the thaw, and for the first time in years, Evelyn Carter didn't feel like she was running from the wild. She was walking back toward it. The clinic fell quiet after Mason left to rest for a few hours. Outside, the mountain wind pressed softly against the windows, and the forest beyond Mercy Creek disappeared into blackness. Evelyn stayed by the table, her hand resting near Finn's paw. His breathing was shallow but steady. Every few minutes, she leaned closer, afraid to find it gone. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and damp fur. A single lamp cast a yellow circle over the metal table. Evelyn had seen a lot of nights like this, long waiting nights, but this one was different. There was something personal in the silence, as if the forest itself was listening. She checked the IV line, then the small heat pad beneath the cub. Mason had shown her how to adjust the saline drip. It wasn't complicated, just delicate. The trick he'd said before going to his office is not to overdo kindness. Too much help can kill as fast as neglect. That sentence kept circling her thoughts. She wasn't sure if he meant the bear or people like her. Hours passed slowly. She sipped black coffee that had gone cold. Every tick of the wall clock sounded like it was marking time for 2 lives instead of 1. Finn's ears twitched occasionally, but he didn't wake. She reached out and brushed a strand of dried grass from his fur. "You're tougher than you look," she whispered. Outside, thunder rolled far off across the valley. It reminded her of the night she lost Daniel, the same low, endless rumble. She'd been waiting at home, counting lightning flashes, when the call came from the ranger station. A poacher's trap had chased 1 bullet. Since then, she'd hated the sound of storms. But tonight, the thunder didn't frighten her. It felt more like company. Near midnight, Mason came back in rubbing sleep from his eyes. He checked the monitor, adjusted the oxygen line. Still holding, he said softly, "But he's weak." Evelyn looked up. "What else can we do?" "Not much. His body needs to decide. We can only make it easier for him to try." He set a stool beside her, lowering his voice. "You'd be surprised how often they fight to the last breath. Wild animals don't give up easily. It's us who struggle to keep believing." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You sound like Daniel." Mason nodded. "He taught me half of what I know about these hills." They fell silent again, the kind of silence that feels like prayer. Finn stirred suddenly, letting out a hoarse sound somewhere between a sigh and a growl. Mason leaned closer, hand over the cub's chest. "He's burning up," he murmured. "Temperature's spiking." He reached for a cool compress, pressing it gently against Finn's neck. The cub's body jerked once. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "He's in pain," she said. "I know," Mason replied. "If we sedate him, we risk shutting his lungs down." We wait. Wait. The hardest word in any rescue. Evelyn wiped sweat from her palms. Minutes turned into an hour. The fever rose higher. Finn trembled, breathing fast, his paw twitching uncontrollably. Mason replaced the compress again and again, each time slower, more careful. At one point, Evelyn whispered, "What if it's too much for him?" Mason didn't answer. His expression said everything. The cub's heartbeat stuttered once and she froze. Mason checked the monitor flat for a second, then a faint beep returned. He exhaled slowly. "Stay with him," he said quietly. "Talk to him." Evelyn leaned in close. "Finn," she whispered. "You're not alone. You hear me?" She wasn't sure if he did, but the words steadied her. "You don't have to be strong. Just stay." Something strange happened. Then a rhythm shifted. His breathing slowed steadier, as if her voice had filled a space between his fear and the darkness pressing in. Mason glanced at her. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he murmured. A sound that reminds them they're not gone yet. He spoke again after a while, voice low but clear. "People think we save animals, but it's more complicated. Sometimes they save what's left of us." Evelyn looked at him surprised. "You believe that I have to," he said. "Otherwise, what's the point of staying up all night for something that might die before sunrise?" She thought about that long after he returned to his office. Maybe that was the secret of this work. It wasn't about control or victory. It was about being present at the edge between life and loss, holding a small space of resistance against indifference. Around 2 a.m., Finn's body convulsed once more, then went still. Evelyn jumped up. "Mason." He was back in seconds, stethoscope to chest. "He's still in there," he muttered. "Barely." He adjusted the oxygen again, tone calm but urgent. "Get me another saline bag." Evelyn grabbed one from the cabinet, hands trembling. Mason connected the line. The cub's paw jerked weakly. Evelyn held his other paw, whispering again, "You're not leaving tonight. Not tonight." Minutes passed. The fever finally began to break. Mason checked the vitals again. "He's cooling down. Good sign." Evelyn sank onto the stool, every muscle heavy with relief. She looked at Mason. "Do you ever get used to this?" He smiled tiredly. "You don't, but you learn to listen better, to see small signs most people miss." He glanced at the cub. "Like how he turned his head when you spoke. That's the kind of thing that tells you when to keep trying." Evelyn leaned forward, studying Finn's tiny movements, the twitch of an ear, the rise and fall of breath. "He's fighting," she said softly. Mason nodded. "They always do until the very end." They sat like that for a while, no words needed. The storm had passed outside. Rain dripped from the roof, steady and slow. Evelyn realized her fear had softened into something else resolve. The kind that comes not from certainty, but from choosing not to quit. Sometime before dawn, Mason dozed off in his chair. Evelyn stayed awake watching the faint rhythm of Finn's breathing. She thought of Daniel again, how he used to say that courage doesn't always look like battle. Sometimes it's just the act of staying beside something fragile until it decides to stand on its own. That thought stayed with her as light began to seep through the blinds. The forest outside was turning pale silver. The first morning bird called from somewhere near the creek. Evelyn leaned closer to Finn, whispering, "You made it." He didn't open his eyes, but his paw flexed slightly against her hand. It was enough. When Mason stirred awake, she pointed. He moved. Mason smiled, voice hoarse. "Then he's telling us he's not done." He checked the vitals again. Temperature normalizing, pulse stronger. "We'll start antibiotics this morning." "He's got a chance now." Evelyn rubbed her temples. "That's all I needed to hear." He studied her for a moment. "You look exhausted." "I've been worse," she said, managing a faint laugh. Mason nodded. "You know, this isn't the first time someone's brought me a lost creature thinking they could save it." "What's different this time?" she asked. "You didn't come here to feel better about yourself," he said. "You came because you couldn't look away." Evelyn didn't reply, but his words lingered. She remembered how Daniel once called compassion the most inconvenient form of courage. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe the forest keeps testing that courage in its own quiet ways. By 7 a.m., sunlight stretched across the clinic floor, catching the edge of Finn's fur. Mason cleaned the wound again, more confident now. "It'll scar," he said, but he'll walk on it." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Good. He's got a whole wilderness waiting." Mason's tone turned gentle. "We'll keep him here a few days, see how he heals. Then we'll talk about what comes next." Evelyn's eyes met his. "You mean if he can ever go back?" "Exactly," Mason said. "But for now, he stays alive." "That's enough." She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. The lesson was simple but profound. Sometimes survival itself is victory. Later, when Mason went to make notes, Evelyn stood at the window. Outside, the forest looked new again, clean, forgiving. She wondered how many mornings like this she'd missed while hiding from her own losses. She whispered to the glass. "Thank you," though she wasn't sure who she was speaking to. Behind her, Finn made a faint sound, a soft huff, almost like a sigh of contentment. She turned and smiled. He had no idea that his fight through the longest night had already changed 2 lives, his and hers. As Mason came back into the room holding a tray of medicine, he caught her gaze. "Get some rest, Evelyn. The hard part's over." She shook her head. "No, Mason. The hard part's just begun. Now he has to learn how to live again." Outside, the first light of dawn spread over the valley, catching the edges of pine needles and river mist. In Mercy Creek, the longest night had ended, but the true test of healing for both bear and human was only just beginning. By the 3rd morning, the air at Mercy Creek had changed. The storm had passed the forest dripping quietly, and for the first time sunlight reached through the window of the recovery room. Evelyn sat cross-legged near the table camera, forgotten watching the cubs stir beneath a layer of clean towels. Finn blinked, eyes adjusting, and for a brief moment his gaze found hers. It wasn't fear this time, it was something closer to curiosity. Mason leaned against the counter arms, folded tired, but smiling. "There it is," he said softly. "Recognition. That's a good sign." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "He knows where he is." "Not exactly," Mason said, "but he knows he's safe for now. That's how it starts." The next days passed in slow rhythm. Finn's fever broke completely. He began to lift his head, sniffing the air each time Evelyn approached. His appetite returned, first a good omen. Mason mixed the formula, explaining that orphaned grizzly cubs require a specific diet, goat milk, fish oil, and a bit of protein paste. "They grow fast," he said, stirring carefully. By next month, he could double in weight. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Guess I'll need a bigger jacket." Mason chuckled. "You'll need a stronger back." Feeding him wasn't simple. At first, Finn refused the bottle, turning away each time. Evelyn kept trying patient quiet. Finally, when she hummed a low tune Daniel used to whistle an old mountain song, the cub hesitated, then latched on. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Guess he likes music." "Or ghosts," Evelyn murmured. The melody carried through the small clinic, mixing with the steady hum of the incubator. In that moment, the world outside the poachers, the traps, the grief felt very far away. Each day brought something new. One morning, Finn tried to stand. His paw, still weak, he stumbled, collapsed, then tried again. Evelyn crouched nearby, whispering, "That's it, one more time." Mason watched from the doorway. "Grizzlies don't know the word quit," he said quietly. "It's instinct. You'd be surprised how often that saves them." Evelyn thought about that as Finn practiced balance, his clumsy movements growing stronger. It reminded her of her own life, the way she'd stumbled through years of quiet after Daniel's death, surviving by sheer instinct. Healing, she realized, wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about learning to move with it. When Finn began to explore the corners of his pen, everything became a new adventure. He sniffed Mason's boots, pawed at the cabinet door, and discovered that the reflection in a metal pan could startle him enough to jump. Evelyn laughed for the first time in months, a sound that startled even her. Mason smiled from across the room. "Haven't heard that since last winter," he said. She shrugged, cheeks flushed. "Guess he's contagious." Outside, spring began to spread through the valley. Mason suggested short sessions in the fenced yard so Finn could feel sunlight and grass. He needs to remember the textures, Mason said. The smell of soil, the way wind moves. Wild animals learn by touch long before sight. Evelyn nodded, watching as Finn stepped hesitantly onto the wet earth. His nose twitched fur, glistening in the morning light. A butterfly passed, and he followed it clumsily, tumoring into the grass. Evelyn's laughter came again, lighter this time. During one of those mornings, Mason shared a small story. Years ago, he'd rescued a wolf pup with a broken jaw. He wouldn't eat for days, Mason said. I thought he was done. Then one morning, I found him chewing a stick, teaching himself how to use his mouth again. Nature teaches survival better than we ever could. He looked at Finn. Every creature has its own way of returning. Evelyn listened, realizing how much that truth applied to people too. In the evenings after Mason left, Evelyn stayed behind, taking notes for feeding each new behavior. She started filming short clips, not for social media, but for herself. Small moments, Finn pushing over his food bowl, stretching his paw toward the window, pausing to listen when the creek outside gurgled. She found herself narrating softly, not for an audience, but out of habit. "This is day 10, she whispered once. "He's figured out the sound of the door before I even touch it. Smart boy." She began to see patterns in his recovery, the small victories that built towards something bigger. When Finn managed to climb onto a low stool without falling, Mason called it graduation day. When he started to growl playfully during feeding, Evelyn learned how to respond with a calm voice, mimicking the rhythm of a mother bear's reassurance. Mason explained, "That low hum. That's what they used to say. You're fine." Evelyn practiced until her voice matched the tone. The first time Finn pressed his head against her knee in response, she nearly cried. Days blended into weeks. Mason often reminded her, "Keep a little distance. He's wild. You can care without claiming." But Evelyn already knew the danger of crossing that invisible line. She wasn't trying to tame him, she was trying to understand him. There's a difference. One afternoon, she brought a small clay pot from her cabin. It was one she'd made years ago and left unfired, its surface rough and gray. While Finn napped, she worked it gently with her hands, reshaping the rim. Mason noticed. "Haven't seen you with clay in a long time," he said. She smiled without looking up. "Feels right again." Clay had always been her language of healing, something about giving form to softness. As she smoothed the pot's edge, she thought about the parallels, rebuilding shape after damage, finding balance through touch. Finn stirred in his sleep, making small noises. The world, she thought, was full of things learning to mend. The days stretched warm and bright. Finn's fur thickened his movements faster. Mason began short rewilding exercises, placing logs for him to climb, hiding food beneath rocks. "He's not playing," Mason explained. "He's remembering." Evelyn watched him stalk a leaf blown across the pen muscles, coiling in miniature precision. "You think he'll ever go back?" she asked. Mason hesitated. "Maybe, but not soon. Injured cubs like him rarely survive alone. The wild demands perfection." His words sat heavily. Evelyn wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She'd seen enough of life to understand that survival wasn't always freedom. Still, she held on to hope. She told Mason about Daniel's old dream, creating a network of sanctuaries for animals too broken for the wild. "He used to say we owe them that much," she said quietly. Mason looked thoughtful. "Maybe this is your chance to finish what he started." That evening, Evelyn stood outside as dusk fell, listening to the forest breathe. Finn pressed his face against the glass, watching the trees sway. She whispered, "That's where you belong someday." The cub blinked as if he understood. The next morning, something changed. Finn startled at a sound, an eagle's cry above the ridge, and bolted into the far corner of the pen. He shook eyes wide. Evelyn moved slowly toward him, humming the same low tune. After a moment, he relaxed, pressing his head against her arm. Mason, who had watched quietly from the doorway, said, "That right there is trust, hard-earned. Don't lose it." Evelyn nodded, though a pang of fear settled in her chest. Trust between wild and human was a fragile thread, beautiful but dangerous. Later that day, Mason brought out a feathered toy attached to a string. "Let's test his reflexes," he said. Finn crouched instantly, tail flicking. His movements were clumsy but determined. When he pounced, the toy went flying. Evelyn laughed again, clapping softly. Mason grinned. Still got the hunter in him. The exercises continued over the next week. Finn learned to climb, to sniff out hidden food, to splash in shallow water without panic. Each day he became more himself, less a patient, more a creature of the wild. Watching him grow, Evelyn felt a quiet shift inside her. It wasn't pride. It was a gratification to witness life remembering itself. Mason noticed the change too. "You've learned almost as much as he has," he said one evening as they locked up. She smiled. "Maybe that's the point. He's learning how to be a bear again, and I'm learning how to live again." Mason nodded. "That's how it works. Healing runs both ways." By the end of the month, Finn was nearly unrecognizable from the frail cub she'd found. His coat glowed with health. His gait had steadied. He even growled softly when Mason entered, a good sign of returning instinct. "He's remembering what he is," Mason said. "That's progress." Evelyn spent one last quiet evening in the clinic, sitting beside him as he slept. She thought of Daniel, of everything that had brought her here, the trap, the fear, the rain. It all led to this small, steady breath beside her. Sometimes she realized love isn't about holding on. It's about preparing to leave. The next morning, Mason mentioned an evaluation team from the State Wildlife Department. "They'll want to see how he's adapting," he said. "If he keeps improving, we can move him to a transitional enclosure." Evelyn nodded, though her stomach tightened. Change was coming. That night, as she turned off the clinic lights, Finn lifted his head and made a low rumbling sound, not fear, not hunger, just acknowledgement. Evelyn smiled through the dark. The forest outside whispered through the pines, as if echoing the same message. The hardest lessons are never about surviving. They're about letting the wild find its way home again. By June, Mercy Creek had turned green again. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and thawing soil, and mornings began with the low hum of bees around the lilac bushes outside the clinic. Inside, Finn was growing fast. His fur had thickened a deep copper brown now, and when he walked, the floorboards seemed to remember his steps. He was no longer a patient, he was a presence. Evelyn had stopped measuring time by days. It was measured now by moments, by each sign that Finn was claiming his own strength. The first time he knocked over his water bowl with a deliberate paw swipe, she knew something inside him had shifted. He was no longer trying to survive. He was beginning to live. Mason noticed it too. "He's entering his testing phase," he said one afternoon as Finn tugged playfully at his sleeve. "That's when young grizzlies start figuring out their power. It's good and dangerous." Evelyn crouched nearby, laughing as Finn tried to grab her bootlace. "He's just curious." "Curious," Mason said, is one word for it. "Wild is another." The line hung in the air. It wasn't a warning, more like a reminder. Evelyn knew what he meant. She'd seen the flicker of wildness in Finn's eyes lately, that brief, instinctive spark that didn't look at her for approval anymore. It looked past her toward the trees beyond the fence. That night, while cleaning his pen, she noticed him staring out through the mesh head tilted toward the dark forest. The moonlight made his coat glow like bronze. He stayed that way for a long time, listening to something only he could hear, the call of his kind, maybe, or just the endless quiet of open space. Evelyn whispered, "You miss it, don't you?" He turned briefly, nose twitching at her scent, then back to the trees. The wild was still in him. It always had been. The next morning, Mason met her with news. The State Wildlife Board approved Finn's transition to the open enclosure, he said. "Half an acre of wood stream access, minimal contact." Evelyn froze mid-step. "That's good, right?" "It's necessary," Mason said gently. "He's ready to learn without us now." She nodded, but her chest tightened. She knew what came after this stage. Once Finn adjusted to independence, the question of release or permanent sanctuary would have to be decided. And decisions like that never came easy. Still, she helped Mason prepare the new enclosure. They scattered logs, dug a small pool fed by creek water, and placed stones where sunlight could warm them. Evelyn added one small thing Mason didn't notice: a flat rock at the far end of the fence. She set it there because Daniel once told her that bears love sunlit stones, places to rest where they can watch the world safely. It felt like a quiet blessing. When they moved Finn, the moment felt both monumental and ordinary. Mason opened the carrier door and Finn stepped out hesitantly. Then, with a short huff, he took his first few strides into the grass. He sniffed, pawed at a branch, then climbed awkwardly over a log. Evelyn stood at the fence hands pressed against the wire, watching as he explored the space that belonged to him alone. "He's doing fine," Mason said behind her, instincts leading the way. She nodded, eyes wet but smiling. "That's what I hoped for." Over the next week, Finn changed more than Evelyn expected. He grew bolder, louder, and more independent. He learned to dig for grubs to splash in the water without fear to roll in the dirt after eating. His clumsy movements were becoming deliberate. Sometimes, when she arrived in the morning, he barely glanced at her. It stung a little, but it was also right. Mason noticed the shift in her expression one day. "Don't take it personally," he said. "If he ignored you, that means we did our job." "I know," she said softly. "Still feels strange. That's what happens when you give something back to the wild. It doesn't look back." His words landed quietly. Evelyn tried to smile. "Then I'll keep waving anyway." That evening after Mason left, she stayed by the fence longer than usual. Finn was sprawled on his back in the grass legs in the air, playing with a twig. When she laughed, he stopped, rolled to his feet, and gave a sharp snort, the kind of sound bears make when they're annoyed but curious. It startled her, then made her laugh harder. "Guess you're not a baby anymore," she said. The sound came again, deeper this time. Then, to her surprise, he ambled closer and pressed his nose briefly to the wire before wandering off again. That small, fleeting gesture that touched the choice to return for just a second felt like a goodbye wrapped in trust. Days later, the pattern broke. Evelyn arrived to find Finn pacing restlessly. He'd torn up part of the log pile, and claw marks streaked the fence posts. Mason frowned as he examined the scene. "It's the season," he said. "Something out there's calling him, probably another bear's scent." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "He wants to go." Mason nodded. "They always do." That night, sleep wouldn't come. She sat by her cabin window, listening to the forest. A wolf howled somewhere far off. The call wasn't sad, it was raw, real alive. She thought about how humans spend their whole lives building walls against that kind of calling, how easily they forget what it's like to answer it. Maybe that's what Finn was reminding her of, that the wild within us never really dies. It just waits for permission. The next morning, Mason caught her staring at the tree line. "You're thinking of releasing him, aren't you?" Evelyn hesitated. "I'm thinking about whether it's fair to keep him." Mason sighed. Fairness isn't simple. Out there, one misstep and he's gone. No mother to teach him how to hunt or where to hide. He's healthy now, but health doesn't mean prepared. She looked at him. "So what are we doing then? Saving him or keeping him alive for us?" Mason didn't answer right away. He walked to the fence, watching Finn swat lazily at the water. "I ask myself that every day," he admitted. "But here's what I've learned. The goal isn't control, it's stewardship. We don't decide what they become. We just help them get far enough to find out." Evelyn considered that. Maybe that was the balance she'd been missing all along, not rescuing the wild, but walking beside it long enough for it to remember itself. Later that afternoon, a small group of visitors arrived, local school children touring the facility. Mason led them through the outer enclosures, explaining the stories behind each rescue: a fox hit by a truck, an eagle with a broken wing, and finally Finn. The children pressed close to the fence, wide-eyed, as the grizzly cub rose on his hind legs and sniffed the air. Evelyn stood back, watching their faces. One girl whispered, "He's smiling." Evelyn almost corrected her, but then stopped. "Maybe he was." After the group left, Mason said quietly, "You see that he's already teaching?" Evelyn nodded. "He doesn't even know it." None of them do, Mason said. But that's how it works. The wild reminds us what's worth protecting. As summer deepened, the rhythm at Mercy Creek became calm again. Finn spent most of his time exploring, resting, and occasionally showing off his new strength. Evelyn resumed her photography, capturing moments when he blended almost perfectly into the green around him. Through the lens, he looked both part of the world and apart from it, a living symbol of what still exists between human care and untamed freedom. One evening, while editing photos, she noticed something in one frame, her own reflection faintly visible in the fence's shadow. It struck her how thin the distance really was between them, how the same longing lived in both hearts. One for the forest, one for the peace that the forest represented. That night, as she locked the clinic, Mason handed her a small folded paper. "Something I wrote once," he said. Found it cleaning the drawer. It was an old letter he'd never sent to his younger self. "Remember why you started," it read. "Not to fix the wild, but to listen to it. The moment you stop listening, you start losing." Evelyn tucked it into her pocket. "You still believe that?" Mason nodded. "It's the only thing that keeps me here." She looked through the window at Finn's silhouette under the trees. "Then maybe it's what keeps us all here." As she walked back to her cabin, the wind carried the faint rustle of leaves and something else, a low rhythmic growl from the enclosure. Not angry, not afraid, just alive. It was the sound of a creature remembering what it was born to be. Evelyn stopped listening and whispered, "That's right, Finn. Keep it. Never lose that." The next morning, she found a notice on the clinic desk, an invitation from a sanctuary near Flathead Valley, a place for unreleasable predators. Mason held it up. "They're asking if we're ready to let him go." Evelyn stared at the letter, heart tightening. The forest outside rustled softly, as if already aware. The wild within her and within Finn had reached the same crossroad, learning when to hold on and when to let go. The letter from the Flathead Sanctuary sat on Mason's desk for 2 days before anyone spoke about it again. Evelyn pretended not to notice it each time she passed by, though she could feel its presence like a stone in her shoe. Every morning, she'd visit Finn's enclosure, greet him with her soft whistle, and pretend everything was the same. But something in him had changed. He was restless again. He'd started pacing after sunset, circling the same patch of ground until the grass wore thin. Mason said it was normal. "Animals sense transitions before we do," he explained. "Maybe he feels what's coming." Still, the unease spread between them like a silent current. And then one evening, the rhythm broke. Evelyn arrived to find Finn lying in the far corner, unmoving. His breathing was shallow, eyes half closed. A smear of blood stained the ground near his paw. His old wound reopened. Panic surged through her. "Mason." Within minutes, he was at her side, medical kit in hand. He knelt, touched the cub's neck, then frowned. "He's burning up." "What happened?" "Could be infection. Maybe." "Heat stress," Mason muttered. "Or both. We'll need to move him inside." They worked quickly, sliding the groggy cub onto a tarp and carrying him to the treatment room. Mason's face was steady, but his hands moved fast, antibiotics, fluids, cold compresses. Evelyn hovered nearby, holding the IV line, whispering to Finn in between Mason's instructions. "You're all right. You've done this before." But this was worse. The fever rose fast, higher than it had during the first rescue. Finn twitched and let out a low moan, a sound that froze Evelyn's chest. Mason's tone stayed calm, though his jaw was tight. "We'll cool him, keep fluids going, monitor every hour." She looked at him sharply. "And if that doesn't work?" He hesitated just long enough for the silence to answer. That night became a blur of movement. Mason mixed medications, charted vitals. Evelyn never left the cub's side. Around midnight, Finn began to shiver violently. Evelyn pressed her palm against his chest, feeling the erratic rhythm beneath her fingertips. "Please," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to the cub or to someone listening beyond. Mason adjusted the IV again, murmuring, "You remember what I said before? Sometimes all we can do is give them the chance to fight." Evelyn nodded, though her throat was too tight to speak. She remembered that night weeks ago, the storm, the stillness, the moment she thought she'd lose him. She remembered her own words. Not tonight. Now the same prayer returned. Around 2 a.m., Mason stepped into the hallway to make a call to a wildlife consultant. Evelyn was alone with Finn, the room dim except for the blue glow of the monitor. She could hear the faint rhythm of his breathing, rough and uneven. She began to hum that old mountain song again, the one Daniel used to whistle. The melody filled the quiet, soft and steady. She didn't care if it helped. It helped her. For a moment, Finn's breathing steadied. Then came a soft sound, almost a sigh. Evelyn leaned closer, eyes stinging. "That's it, sweetheart. Keep going." Mason returned with more medication, his expression grim but focused. "No sedation," he said. "Too risky. We'll keep him cool, keep him still." He placed a damp cloth over Finn's head, checking his pulse. "You should rest, Evelyn." She shook her head. "If he's awake, I'm awake." He didn't argue. He knew better by now. Hours slipped by. Outside, the forest was black and silent. The only sound was the steady drip of the IV. Mason eventually dozed off in the chair, and Evelyn sat cross-legged on the floor beside the table, whispering whenever Finn stirred. "You're stronger than this," she said softly. "You've got a creek to swim in and berries waiting out there. You've got more work to do." Somewhere between exhaustion and faith, she closed her eyes and drifted. In her half-sleep, she dreamed of Daniel standing by the same creek where she'd found Finn. He was smiling, holding a camera in one hand, pointing at something in the distance. When she followed his gaze, she saw a bear standing in the mist, healthy, massive, powerful. But when she called out, both figures faded into the trees. She woke to the sound of Mason's voice. "He's stabilizing." Dawnlight filtered through the blinds. Mason was leaning over the table, checking the monitors. "Temperature's dropping, heart rate steadying." Evelyn scrambled to her feet, blinking through tears. "He's okay." "Too early to celebrate," Mason said, "but he's turned a corner." Finn's eyes fluttered open then, just for a second. His gaze met hers, cloudy, weak, but alive. Evelyn smiled through her exhaustion. "There you are." Mason exhaled deeply. "I swear this cub's got 9 lives." Evelyn laughed weakly. "He's only using them faster than I can count." For the rest of the morning, they worked in silence, taking turns watching over him. Mason brewed coffee strong enough to taste like smoke. Between sips, he said quietly, "You ever think about what keeps people like us doing this? All the heartbreak, the endless nights?" Evelyn looked at him. "You mean, why do we keep believing?" He nodded. "Maybe because the alternative is not believing," she said simply. He smiled faintly. "That's as good a reason as any." He told her then about a time early in his career, how he'd rescued a mountain lion cub and spent months nursing it back, only for it to die from a simple infection. "I nearly quit," he admitted. "Told myself the wild didn't want my help. But the next day someone brought in a bald eagle with a broken wing. And when that bird finally flew again, well, that's what keeps you coming back." Evelyn nodded. Faith disguised as work. Exactly. Later, when Mason stepped outside to call the sanctuary again, Evelyn stayed alone with Finn. She placed her hand gently against his paw. It was cool now, steady. She whispered, "You scared us, you know." The cub's nose twitched, his breathing deep but calm. She could see the faint rise and fall of his chest and realized that life isn't a straight line. It's a series of small recoveries, moments where the heart chooses to stay. Survival isn't about strength alone. It's about faith, the quiet kind that keeps working even when hope feels like a fragile thread. By afternoon, Mason returned with news. The sanctuary still has space. They're ready whenever he's cleared for transfer. Evelyn ran her hand through her hair. "You think he's ready?" "He will be," Mason said. "But not yet. He needs a week or 2 to rebuild." Evelyn looked toward the window where sunlight touched the trees. "A week? That's not much time." Mason's tone softened. "It never is." That evening, they moved Finn back to the enclosure. He stood on shaky legs but managed to walk a few steps before collapsing into the grass. Evelyn knelt outside the fence, heart swelling. "You did it," she said. "You came back." Mason smiled. "He'll be fine now. You, on the other hand, might need a vacation." She laughed, rubbing her tired eyes. "Maybe after I learn how to let go." Mason gave a small nod. "That's the part no one teaches. Letting go is another kind of rescue." They stood there for a while, watching Finn sleep under the pale light. The forest around Mercy Creek began to hum again, crickets, wind water. The rhythm of the wild had returned, carrying both peace and melancholy in its current. Before leaving, Mason said, "I'll make the call tomorrow. Flathead will take good care of him." Evelyn didn't respond. She just kept watching Finn's slow breathing, memorizing the sound. That night, as she walked back to her cabin, the air was thick with the scent of pine and rain. She stopped once, looking up at the stars, barely visible through the branches. Somewhere out there, life continued fierce, fragile, unstoppable. She whispered, "Thank you to no one in particular." Inside the cabin, she found the letter from the sanctuary, folded neatly on her table. She finally opened it and read the last line aloud. "Every rescued creature is a story of endurance, not rescue." She smiled faintly. "Guess that makes you an author now, Finn." The next morning, the sun rose clear over the valley, washing the clinic and forest in gold. Finn stirred stronger than before. Mason was already on the phone arranging the transfer. Evelyn stood by the fence, quiet, resolute. The hardest part of every rescue was never the saving, it was the leaving. And soon both she and Finn would learn that lesson in full. The morning of the transfer came with quiet skies. The air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. Evelyn stood beside the transport crate, her hands resting on the edge, watching Finn pace inside. He wasn't afraid, just alert. His eyes followed every movement, every sound of the loading straps. Mason stood nearby, clipboard in hand, talking to the driver from the Flathead Wildlife Sanctuary. "He'll be sedated just enough to stay calm," Mason said. "They've got a full team waiting." Evelyn nodded, though her throat felt tight. She'd prepared everything: his favorite blanket, the one he used to curl against during storms, the small flat rock from his pen, a folded note for whoever would care for him next. She'd written it in careful script. He likes the sound of running water. He hides his food under leaves. And when he tilts his head, it's not confusion, it's curiosity. Mason checked the straps again, then looked at her. "You sure you don't want me to take him?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, I need to see where he's going." The drive to Flathead Valley took most of the day. The road wound through open country, long stretches of pine forest, giving way to fields and rivers that shimmered under sunlight. Finn slept through most of it, the sedative keeping him calm. Evelyn sat beside the crate, watching him breathe. Each rise and fall of his chest carried the memory of every night she thought she'd lose him. Mason drove, eyes steady on the road. After a long silence, he said, "You know, the first time I sent one off like this, I nearly turned the truck around, halfway." Evelyn smiled faintly. "What stopped you?" "The animal," he said. Even half sedated, she kept looking out the window like she already knew where she was headed. Sometimes we think we're teaching them how to heal, but maybe they're just teaching us when to let go. The truck climbed the final ridge as late afternoon light fell across the valley. Ahead, wooden signs appeared: Flathead Wildlife Sanctuary, dedicated to the care and conservation of Montana's native predators. Evelyn exhaled slow and shaky. The sanctuary wasn't a zoo. It was a refuge, a home for those who could no longer live wild, but still deserved space, dignity, and freedom within boundaries. When the truck stopped, a woman in her 60s walked toward them, silver hair tied back, soft eyes, hands strong from work. "You must be Mason," she said, shaking his hand. "And you're Evelyn." Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime among creatures that demanded both patience and respect. "I'm Margaret. Welcome to Flathead." Evelyn followed her through the gates. Beyond lay open enclosures filled with trees, rock ledges, and running streams. Each space was built to mirror the wild as closely as possible. Wolves dozed in the distance, a bald eagle stretched its wings on a perch, and near the far end an old cougar lay sunning itself on a wooden platform. Margaret led them to a smaller clearing surrounded by fencing so well blended it almost disappeared among the trees. "This will be Finn's first area," she said. "A quarantine zone just for observation. Once he's adjusted, we'll move him to the ambassador habitat with the other unreleasable bears." Ambassador Evelyn asked. Margaret smiled. "We call them that because they help teach visitors what conservation really means. Not lectures, presents. People remember what they see more than what they're told." The words sank deep. Evelyn thought of all the people who'd stopped to watch Finn through the fence at Mercy Creek, how even a brief glimpse of him had softened something in them. Maybe this was the life he was meant for. Not the danger of open forests, but the power to remind others what wildness still exists. Together, they lifted the crate into the clearing. Mason checked the vitals one last time, then opened the latch. Finn stirred, blinking as the cool air hit his face. He sniffed once, twice, and stepped forward. His paws sank into damp earth. He looked around slowly, testing the wind, the sounds, the scent of other bears lingering faintly in the distance. Evelyn crouched low, speaking softly. "Go on, Finn. This is yours now." He turned once toward her, head tilted as if memorizing her face, then padded into the enclosure, moving with the slow, steady gait of something that had found its rhythm again. Margaret stood beside her. "He'll need a few days before he understands this place is safe." "But he will. They always do." Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. Mason rested a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said simply. Later they walked through the sanctuary grounds, with Margaret learning about the residents' stories: a black bear rescued from a wildfire, a fox who'd lost a paw, a wolf named Boone who'd become the favorite of school children. Each of them was broken once Margaret said, "But broken doesn't mean finished. Around here we just help them find a new purpose." That sentence stayed with Evelyn. Broken doesn't mean finished. She thought of her pottery at home, how the Japanese art of kintsugi filled cracks with gold to honor what had survived instead of hiding the damage. Maybe that's what this place was doing for these animals, turning their scars into lessons. Before leaving, Margaret handed her a volunteer badge. "You're welcome here anytime," she said. "A lot of rescuers find it hard to walk away. Some keep coming back until the wild feels a little less far." Evelyn accepted it, tracing the logo, a bear silhouette surrounded by pine branches. "Thank you," she said. Back by the truck, Mason closed the tailgate and turned to her. "You all right?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "It feels like goodbye, but also not," he smiled. "It never is, not really." They drove back as dusk settled over the valley. The sanctuary lights glowed faintly in the rearview mirror, small beacons against the encroaching dark. Evelyn stared at them until they disappeared. Halfway home, Mason broke the silence. "You remember what we said at the start, that wildness doesn't need saving, just understanding?" Evelyn nodded. "Well," he said today, "you understood it. That's rarer than rescue." She didn't reply. She just looked out the window at the forest, passing by dark outlines, endless alive. She realized she wasn't sad, not really. What she felt was something deeper, quieter, fulfillment. She had done what she was meant to do, and that was enough. When they reached Mercy Creek, the air smelled of rain again. Evelyn stepped out of the truck and listened to the familiar sound of water moving through the pines. Mason unloaded the empty crate, setting it beside the porch. "I'll head out," he said. "You should rest." She nodded but didn't move. "Do you ever get used to the silence after they're gone?" He paused. "No. You just learn to listen to it differently." When he drove away, the night deepened. Evelyn stood on the porch for a long time, the hum of crickets filling the gaps left by his departure. Inside, the house felt larger than before, every room echoing faintly. She walked to the small pottery table, touched the half-shaped bowl she'd left drying. Her hands moved automatically, smoothing its edge. Clay-like life could always be reformed with patience and care. She thought of Finn's last look before stepping into the sanctuary, a look that carried no fear, only awareness. It wasn't an ending. It was a continuation in another form. That realization steadied her. Maybe mercy wasn't about holding on. Maybe it was about giving what you can and trusting the rest to unfold where you can't follow. She took out her camera, scrolled through old photos, Finn's first steps, his playful stumbles, his tilted head. Each image felt like a heartbeat, proof of how far they'd both come. Then she began organizing them into a folder labeled The Sanctuary of Second Chances. It wasn't for the public yet. It was for her to remember that healing doesn't always look like return. Sometimes it looks like a release. The next morning, Mason called to check in. They said he settled fine, he reported. Already exploring, ate a full meal. Margaret said he seems curious. Evelyn laughed softly. That sounds like him. Congratulations, Mason said. You gave a wild thing its second chance. She smiled. He gave me mine first. As she hung up, the morning light stretched across the floor, warm and golden. Outside, the forest swayed gently as if breathing. Evelyn poured herself a cup of coffee, sat by the window and whispered, "Safe travels, Finn." The wind carried her words away toward Flathead Valley. The story wasn't over. It was just finding a new rhythm, one heartbeat at a time. A year later, spring returned to Mercy Creek. The snow melt ran thick through the valleys and the pines smelled of new life. Evelyn drove the same winding road she had once taken with a frightened grizzly cub asleep in a crate beside her. This time the passenger seat was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. The silence was gentle now, familiar, as if the forest had learned to speak in ways beyond sound. She had come to see Finn again. Margaret had called a week earlier. "He's doing well," she'd said. "You should come to see what he's become." Evelyn had smiled at that. What he's become. It was strange how a single creature could carry so many versions of life: helpless cub, patient survivor, teacher. The road to Flathead Valley felt shorter this time. When she arrived at the sanctuary, Margaret was waiting by the gate. "He's up by the North Ridge," she said. "You'll recognize him." Evelyn followed the gravel path. Heart, steady breath caught somewhere between pride and ache. The air was cool and sweet. Around her, the sanctuary pulsed with quiet energy. Wolves pacing lazily in their enclosures. Eagles circling high, the wind moving like a soft conversation between branches. When she reached the ridge, she stopped. There he was. Finn, taller, now stronger, his fur a deep bronze that gleamed in the sun. He was sprawled under a pine head, resting on his paws, perfectly still except for the rise and fall of his chest. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't move. She just watched him, remembering the trembling bundle of fur she'd once lifted from a rusted trap. Now here he was, alive, steady, unafraid. Margaret came up beside her. "He spends hours there," she said quietly. "Watches the tree line. Sometimes when wild bears pass near the outer fence, he lifts his head and listens, but he never panics. Just observes." Evelyn smiled. "He remembers." "Maybe," Margaret said. "Or maybe he's teaching himself to be something new, half wild, half witness." Evelyn didn't speak for a while. She just watched the bear breathe. There was something holy in that rhythm, slow, grounded, unhurried. It reminded her that survival isn't just the act of not dying. It's the art of continuing, of adapting. Margaret left her alone for a while, and Evelyn sat on a nearby bench pulling out her camera. Through the lens, she captured the light falling through the branches onto Finn's fur. She didn't zoom in. She didn't need to. The distance between them felt right, respectful. The wild had boundaries, and part of loving it was knowing when to stay behind the line. As she watched, a group of children arrived with a sanctuary guide. They stopped a few yards away, whispering excitedly as the guide spoke. "This is Finn," the man said. "He came here after an injury that left him unable to return to the wild. But he's not a pet. He's a teacher. He reminds us what resilience looks like." The children listened, faces wide with wonder. One boy raised his hand. "Does he miss being free?" The guide smiled. "Maybe, but freedom comes in many forms. Sometimes it means living exactly where you are and still finding peace. Evelyn felt her chest tighten at that. It was the same truth she'd been learning all year. Since Finn's transfer, she had started volunteering at Mercy Creek, helping Mason with other rescues, foxes, owls, even a black bear cub who reminded her a little of him. She wasn't trying to replace him. She'd simply found meaning again in the rhythm of care and giving without expecting to keep. Healing isn't something you finish. It's something you practice. Every sunrise, every act of kindness, every time you choose compassion over indifference, that's healing, repeating itself. Finn stirred, suddenly rising onto his feet. He turned, nose lifted toward the wind. For a second, their eyes met through the distance, amber to brown, wild to human. The moment held no need for words. It wasn't recognition in the human sense, not memory. It was present. Evelyn lowered her camera. She didn't want a photograph of it. Some things are meant to live only in memory, where they stay alive, without needing proof. Margaret returned, standing quietly beside her. "He's still teaching," she said softly. Every visitor who sees him leaves with something different. Some feel sadness, others hope. But all of them see themselves in him. Evelyn nodded. "Because he's not just a bear, he's a mirror." Margaret smiled. "Exactly." As the sun began to dip, they walked back toward the toll, the main building. Along the path, Evelyn noticed the sanctuary's volunteers preparing for the evening rounds, feeding, cleaning, logging, medical notes. Everyone moved with quiet purpose. She thought about what Margaret had said the first day they brought Finn here. Broken doesn't mean finished. Looking around, she saw what that meant in motion life, continuing, shaped by compassion. In the education center, a new display caught her eye. It was titled, "Stories That Saved Us." There were photos of the sanctuary's residents, Boone the wolf, the fox with 3 legs, and near the bottom, a framed image of Finn taken by a visitor. Below it, a short caption, "Rescued from a trap in the forests of Montana. Now an ambassador for conservation and coexistence." Evelyn smiled. "Ambassador," she repeated. It sounded right. Before leaving, she sat with Margaret in the staff kitchen sipping tea. "I always wondered," Evelyn said, "do they ever forget the ones who saved them?" Margaret stirred her cup thoughtfully. "Maybe they don't remember faces, but they remember safety, kindness, tone. The wild doesn't hold grudges or gratitude the way we do, it just responds to energy. When you give it peace, it gives peace back." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That's how the forest remembers." Margaret smiled. "Exactly." On the drive back, twilight settled over the mountains. Evelyn rolled down the window and let the wind rush in. It smelled of pine and earth, and something older, something eternal. She thought about how far she and Finn had both come from that rain-soaked day when pain and fear had bound them together. They had both learned what it meant to keep living, even when the world had changed around them. Back at her cabin, she unpacked her camera and scrolled through the day's photos. The last image, Finn beneath the pine, glowed softly on the screen. She uploaded it to her small photography blog that night with a caption, "He didn't go back to the wild, but the wild never left him." Within hours, messages began to appear. Teachers asked to share the story with students. A wildlife rescue group is inviting her to collaborate on an awareness campaign about illegal traps. People writing about their own small acts of compassion. A dog rescued a bird, freed from fishing line. A raccoon given safe passage across a road. Reading through the messages, Evelyn realized how far the ripples had traveled. Finn's story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever believed that kindness still mattered. The next morning, she stepped onto her porch with a mug of coffee. The forest stretched before her, endless shades of green. A crow landed on the railing, tilting its head, watching her. She smiled. "Good morning," she said. The bird cawed once, then flew off into the tree. Somewhere, maybe miles away, Finn was waking up too, stretching beneath the same sky, listening to the same wind. The thought comforted her. The forest held both of them now in different ways. And that's how nature works. It remembers through continuation. Every act of rescue, every seed planted, every moment of mercy becomes part of its rhythm. We don't have to control it. We just have to join it. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling that rhythm inside her chest. She'd started this journey trying to save one wildlife. Somewhere along the way, that wildness had saved her back. Every time you stop to help, every time you choose compassion instead of convenience, you become part of the forest's memory too. You don't need to be a rescuer or a scientist or even know the right words. You just need to care and act when it counts. Because somewhere out there, something fragile is waiting for the sound of your footsteps, your voice, your choice not to look away. If this story touched something in you, take a moment, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, what's the one small life I could protect today? And if you believe in stories like Finn's stories of endurance, of second chances, of wild hearts that still beat beside ours, then stay with us. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters. And subscribe so we can keep telling the stories the forest refuses to forget. Because in the end, the forest remembers us all.